Record voter turnout and a great ground game by Republicans propelled Republicans to victory in multiple statewide races here in North Carolina. And one of those victors is historic. Rick Henderson is editor-in-chief of Carolina Journal, of course, carolinajournal.com, as well as the print edition of the newspaper, paying very close attention to what this all means. Rick, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Donna, very much.
Let's start with the historic race first. Lieutenant Governor in North Carolina, for the first time, is an African-American, and he's a Republican.
That's right. Mark Robinson defeated Yvonne Lewis Holley by about 3 points. The thing about Mark Robinson is that he and Yvonne Lewis Holley, both African-American candidates, so this would have been historic regardless. But Mark Robinson is someone who is a political newcomer, complete outsider, who was activist in Greensboro and a gun rights activist and the like, but certainly swept people off their feet, I think, on the campaign trail. And also the Democrats didn't really take this race very seriously until the very end, when Michael Bloomberg poured a whole bunch of money into the race that he might as well have lit on fire, apparently, because Holley was actually running neck and neck with Robinson in the polls. In one late poll from the Carolina Partnership for Reform, if I'm not mistaken, the group that's affiliated with Senator Phil Berger, and our friend Bob Rosser is in charge of that, actually had Holley ahead, if I'm not mistaken. And so, but it's also a relatively low interest race for voters, but it could be, I think the reason Democrats got a little bit concerned about the race was that they thought that there was a possibility there would be a 50-50 tie in the state Senate, and the lieutenant governor actually would have to hang around and break ties. But that didn't materialize, and Yvonne Lewis Holley lost also.
And you mentioned the potential 25-25 tie in the Senate, which did not occur. The Republicans did very well in the General Assembly. And later on in the program, we'll be talking with Becky Gray a little bit more detailed about what happened with the Republicans securing, again, their majorities in the North Carolina General Assembly. Rick, you mentioned the issue of money. Tons of money, the bulk of it from Democrats around the country, poured into North Carolina to try to turn this state blue, and it just didn't materialize. Was it the Republicans' ground game? What went on here?
I think the ground game had something to do with it, to be sure. I think our John Locke Foundation chairman, John Hood, stated it very well in a column where he said that Democrats did not take the issue of urban unrest, violence, and rioting seriously. In fact, they didn't exactly enable it or coddle it, but they just did not denounce it seriously as Republicans did. And I think that made some difference at the margins. And it didn't take much at the margins. If you've got basically a 45-45 state to begin with, then you don't have to persuade an awful lot of voters in the middle to make a difference. And all these races up and down the Council of State ballot were very, very close. They were all very within that 45-45 range. And so that entered into it. And also, I just think that the Democrats sort of took for granted the fact that they had a natural advantage because polling, which was
terrible,
wildly wrong in lots of ways, from groups that from all over the map. I mean, from groups that, mainstream media organizations, from advocacy groups left and right, they all got things wrong. And what they got largely wrong, we'll know better when we've got the results to actually dig into and look at, was that Democrats were going to maintain their sort of 7 or 8 point lead among registered voters, and that unaffiliated voters, which now comprise about 1/3 of North Carolina, were going to break 60-40 or even 2-1 Democratic, and that just didn't happen.
The ground game was interesting. Republicans doing very well. They actually went out and knocked on doors and made contacts with voters. But it also appears that President Trump had coattails and helped a lot of those statewide races really go the Republicans' way. Yeah,
that was the thing that I think will be sort of the underreported story that may well have made a difference in North Carolina and other states for President Trump, was that the fact that he was going out and doing these round-the-clock rallies in the final week of the election, and Vice President Biden was maintaining basically his front porch campaign of going around to much smaller events. On WPTF program that you were hosting on election night, Jonathan Felch, Republican consultant, said the Democrats really have to be kicking themselves for not bringing the Obamas into North Carolina in campaign, because President Obama went to a number of states and had some extremely enthusiastic rallies in the final days. And that didn't happen in North Carolina. Both basically concentrated on Kamala Harris, the vice presidential nominee, who's not a particularly effective, or proved not to be a particularly effective stump speaker. And so that, again, it may have made a big difference, is that Donald Trump was showing this incredible amount of energy and enthusiasm, and of course, flouting all the laws and rules regarding social distancing and mask wearing and the like at the rallies. And let's hope this doesn't become a problem down the road. Nonetheless, he drove enthusiastic crowds. I kind of treated this like, well, this was like a Grateful Dead tour. You had the same people sort of following him around everywhere. But it turns out that probably wasn't the case. Or if it was the case, the people who went to these rallies then went back to their homes and their neighborhoods and their churches, and they talked it up, and they really got folks out to the polls. And that showed up on Election Day, where Republicans, generally speaking, got about 300,000 more votes than Democrats. They got about maybe 70% of the vote on Election Day, which was enough to carry Republicans across the line in many cases.
And one of the Republican winners who benefited from the ground game and likely from the Trump rallies is Catherine Truitt, who looks to be North Carolina's next superintendent of public instruction.
That's a huge win for people who are in favor of education reform in North Carolina and breaking the monopoly of the public schools. That she's a big supporter of charter schools. She'll be the outgoing chancellor of Western Governors University, North Carolina. Huge proponent of charter schools. She backs public school choice through opportunity scholarships. She's someone who's going to be probably at odds with the North Carolina Association of Educators and the similar union-backed groups that are heavily Democratic. It's going to be a tenure. I think she's someone who also has a very, very strong personality and will be a force to be reckoned with in a way that I think Mark Johnson, her predecessor, will not be. And so that's going to be fun to watch.
Interesting. Catherine Truitt is someone who seems to be able to get along with everybody, regardless of their political affiliation. But she will be at odds with the returning governor, Roy Cooper,
right,
the Democrat who got a second term, in terms of opportunity scholarships. He does not want to continue that program for low-income kids in North Carolina. Catherine Truitt does. That'll be interesting.
Yes, it will be, and it'll be also interesting because to see what happens with the courts, which is another topic, but nonetheless, she's going to be backed by the General Assembly, which does favor opportunity scholarships, and so it'd be interesting to see if the universal Democratic opportunity scholarship opposition starts to erode a little bit, because some African American Democrats are starting to say, wait a minute, this is really a good deal for poor kids.
Let's hit one more race. Commissioner of Labor, a Republican takes that seat. Josh Dobson wins over Jessica Holmes.
Former state legislator Josh Dobson is going to be somebody who will be standing in the way of attempts to erode North Carolina's right to work laws. And so that's, again, going to be, I think, a big win for both employers and employees in the state.